The whole town laughed at him for building a roof that made no sense, and now they understand why. A broke old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket came to Duluth, Minnesota, hoping winter would leave him alone. Instead, he built something no one had ever seen before, a massive wooden roof that dwarfed his small cabin. They called it a waste of timber, a foolish mistake made by a man past his prime. But when the snow came in walls instead of flakes and the wind howled off Lake Superior, his loyal German shepherd refused to leave the shelter beneath that roof. What the dog sensed and what the town ignored was the difference between surviving winter and being crushed by it. Because when their roofs began to collapse and their firewood froze solid, his strange creation became the only place where life could continue. What he built would humble an entire town and change how they understood winter forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you are watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It is always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter arrived in Duluth not as a season, but as a weight pressing down from the iron-gray sky and settling into every breath drawn near Lake Superior. Frank Walker felt that weight the morning he stepped out of his truck and stood on the raw patch of land he had bought with the last of his savings. The wind came off the lake like a living thing, sharp and deliberate, cutting through wool and denim, finding every weakness in clothing and bone. Frank was 72, tall but slightly stooped, his shoulders still broad from decades of military bearing, even as age had thinned his frame. His face was long and angular, the skin weathered into fine lines by sun, cold, and years spent outdoors. A gray beard trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity framed a mouth that rarely smiled but also rarely complained. His eyes, steel blue, steady and observant, had seen too much to be easily surprised. He wore the same thing he wore almost every day, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, faded at the elbows, layered over a heavy sweater, the collar turned up against the cold like quiet defiance. At his side stood Shadow, a German shepherd nearing 10 years old, large even for his breed, with a dense black and tan coat, dusted now with early snow. Shadow's ears, Jos, stood erect, his amber eyes alert, scanning the empty lots and distant houses, as if assessing threats only he could sense. He was calm but watchful, the kind of dog shaped by loyalty rather than obedience, moving when Frank moved, stopping when Frank stopped, as though an invisible tether bound them together. Frank had not come to Duluth for comfort. He had come because winter here was honest. After leaving the army decades earlier, he had drifted through warmer places, chasing work, then running from it, until retirement forced stillness upon him. The silence that followed had been worse than gunfire. Duluth, with its brutal cold and long nights, reminded him of the Arctic training grounds, where he had learned a truth most civilians never did: winter does not care about intentions, only preparation. The land he stood on sloped gently toward a stand of frost-coated pines. Beyond them, the lake lay hidden, but felt its presence announced by wind and a low, distant roar, like something breathing under ice. Frank closed his eyes briefly and remembered a collapsed forward operating shelter in Alaska, the sound of snow giving way, the panic, the scramble, the bodies pulled out too late. That was the moment that had changed him, the moment that carved caution into his bones. He opened his eyes and looked again at the empty ground. He did not see a cabin first. He saw shelter. Over the next weeks, as autumn tightened into early winter, Frank worked with a methodical patience that drew attention. He began not with walls, but with posts, thick timbers sunk deep into frozen earth, spaced in a broad circle far larger than any small cabin required. Shadow followed him everywhere, nails clicking on packed snow, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or sit facing outward as if guarding an invisible perimeter. Neighbors noticed. Duluth's hillside communities were used to solitude, but curiosity traveled fast. One afternoon, Tom Harris wandered over boots crunching loudly. Tom was in his early 40s, stocky with a round, ruddy face and a permanently skeptical expression. A carpenter by trade, his brown beard was unkempt, and his hands bore the scars of years with saws and nails. He watched Frank measure distances with rope and stakes, shaking his head. "You planning a barn?" Tom asked, half joking. Frank didn't stop working. "Planning a roof," he replied. Tom laughed a short bark of sound and glanced at the circle of posts. "That's a lot of roof for one man." Frank finally looked up, his gaze level and unreadable. "Winter's a lot bigger than one man, too." Tom shrugged, unconvinced, and left with a muttered comment about old soldiers and strange ideas. More eyes followed in the days that came. Sarah Collins, who lived 3 houses down, paused during her morning walks to observe. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and lean with pale skin that flushed pink in the cold, and light brown hair usually pulled into a practical ponytail beneath a knit cap. She worked as a school librarian, quiet by nature, thoughtful, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. There was kindness in her narrow face and curiosity in her green eyes. She did not laugh like others did, but she frowned slightly, trying to understand. Once, when Shadow approached her calmly, tail low but friendly, she crouched to scratch behind his ears, noting the scar along his flank, a pale line hidden beneath thick fur. "He's seen things, hasn't he?" she said softly. Frank nodded once. "We both have." That was all. As the frame rose, so did the whispers. People said Frank was wasting good lumber, that he'd misjudged his strength, that the structure would never hold. Frank heard them, but did not respond. His internal world was quieter than the town's chatter, shaped by routines and memories he rarely revisited unless forced. At night, sitting in the small rented room he occupied until his cabin would be livable, he studied old notebooks filled with sketches and calculations. His handwriting was precise, disciplined, born of years filling out reports where mistakes cost lives. He adjusted angles, recalculated load distribution, and thought of Shadow sleeping nearby, trusting him completely. That trust was a weight heavier than any snow. Frank refused to fail it. By late November, snow began to fall in earnest. The circle of posts now supported a wide, sloping framework that extended far beyond where the cabin would eventually stand. Frank worked slower in the cold, his breath visible, his joints aching, but he did not stop. Shadow stayed close sometimes, whining softly, when wind gusts shook the timbers as if warning him. One morning, Frank slipped on ice and landed hard on his side. Pain flared sharp and bright. Shadow barked once, urgent, and pressed against him until Frank stood again, breathing through clenched teeth. He rested, then leaning against a post, and for a moment doubt crept in. He was old. The winter was coming fast. He could still walk away. The thought passed as quickly as it came. Walking away had never saved anyone. When the first real storm hit, the sky vanished behind swirling white, and the wind howled like artillery. Frank stood beneath the partially finished roof, snow striking the outer edges and sliding away, leaving the ground around him surprisingly clear. He watched Shadow sit beside him, snow collecting on his back without concern, and felt something unfamiliar loosen in his chest. Not pride. Relief. The structure was already doing what it was meant to do. Beyond the circle, houses disappeared into drifts. Frank imagined families shoveling cursing roofs, groaning under uneven weight. He did not judge them. He simply understood what they did not yet. As night fell and the storm raged on, Frank packed up his tools and looked once more at the skeleton of wood rising against the dark. This was only the beginning. Winter had not even shown its teeth. But for the first time since arriving in Duluth, Frank Walker felt ready. Frank did not explain himself, not to the neighbors who lingered at the edge of his land, not to the man at the hardware store, who raised an eyebrow when Frank ordered more timber than a small cabin required, and not even to Sarah Collins, when she politely asked one afternoon what he planned to do with all that open space beneath the rising structure. Winter was already tightening its grip on Duluth, shortening the days and sharpening the wind, and Frank had learned long ago that explanations wasted energy better spent preparing. In the evenings after his hands had gone numb from cold and his shoulders burned from lifting beams, he returned to the small cabin room he was still finishing inside the sheltering frame. He lit the stove, fed it slowly, and let the iron warmth creep back into his bones. Shadow lay nearby, his large body curled with practiced efficiency, his head resting against Frank's old combat boots, the leather cracked and softened by decades of use. The dog's muzzle was graying now, especially around the eyes, but his posture remained alert even in rest ears, twitching at distant sounds, as if some part of him was still standing guard. Frank took out a weathered leather folder from a metal footlocker and spread its contents across the rough table. Inside were blueprints drawn in pencil and ink, edges softened by years of folding and unfolding designs for cold weather shelters Frank had first studied in his 30s while stationed in Alaska. The lines were clean, purposeful, the angles deliberate. These were not theoretical ideas dreamed up in classrooms, but solutions forged in places where mistakes cost fingers, limbs, or lives. As Frank traced the lines with a calloused finger memory, pressed in heavy as the snow he was planning for, he remembered a training exercise north of Fairbanks, a temporary supply structure built too quickly, its roof pitched steep but uneven snow drifting into weak points along the seams. The collapse came at night, sudden and absolute, the sound like thunder muffled by white. 2 men never made it out. One of them, a young corporal with a crooked smile and a habit of humming old rock songs, had shared coffee with Frank less than an hour before. That image never left him. It shaped the way he thought, the way he built, the way he prepared for winter, as if it were an enemy that studied you back. During the day, as the umbrella roof took more recognizable form, Frank's silence became a kind of provocation. Tom Harris watched from a distance, arms crossed over his thick jacket, his skeptical eyes narrowing as the geometry of the structure revealed itself. Tom had built half the porches in their part of Duluth, his work solid if unremarkable, and he trusted tradition more than innovation. To him, Frank's design looked wrong, too open, too exposed. But Tom also noticed things he didn't like to admit, such as how the snow slid cleanly off the outer beams even during early storms, how the ground beneath stayed darker, less choked with ice. He said nothing, his pride bristling, but doubt had begun to seed itself quietly. Sarah Collins, on the other hand, noticed details without the need to challenge them. She walked her usual route past Frank's land almost daily, her long coat belted tight around her slim frame, her pale face reddened by cold strands of brown hair escaping her cap. She saw how Frank moved slowly but deliberately, conserving energy, never rushing, and how Shadow mirrored him, positioning himself instinctively between Frank and the open valley whenever the wind rose. Sarah had grown up in Duluth and respected winter the way one respects an unpredictable elder never fully trusted, never fully understood. Watching Frank work stirred something uneasy and compelling in her, as though she were witnessing knowledge that had been lost and was now being quietly restored. One evening after a day of heavy labor, Frank sat alone with his blueprints spread out, adjusting measurements by lamplight. Shadow rose suddenly, ears pricked, and let out a low, warning growl. Frank looked up just as a knock sounded at the edge of the structure. It was not loud, more tentative than demanding. Outside stood a man Frank hadn't seen before, bundled in a thick parka, dusted with snow. His name was Michael O'Rourke, though he introduced himself simply as Mike. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw, his beard thick and peppered with white eyes, tired but sharp. Mike worked for the city, maintaining roads and emergency access routes, and years of being called out in storms had etched a certain grim patience into his demeanor. He apologized for intruding, explaining that he'd been sent to assess a nearby culvert, but couldn't help noticing Frank's construction. "Never seen anything like it around here," Mike said, his breath fogging in the cold. Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded once. He respected men who worked outside when others stayed in. Mike walked the perimeter boots, crunching softly, and gestured upward. "You building for snow load or wind?" he asked. Frank considered the question carefully. "Both," he answered. Mike's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's rare," he said, not mockingly, but with genuine interest. Before leaving, he glanced at Shadow, who watched him steadily. "Smart dog," Mike said. "Smart dogs pick smart shelters." Frank allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile after the man left. That night, Frank dreamed of white expanses and dark skies, of shelters that held and shelters that failed. He woke before dawn, heart steady but heavy, and lay listening to the wind sweep across the structure above him. It sounded different now, broken, redirected, less threatening. The roof was not finished, not yet, but it was already changing the way the land responded to winter. In the days that followed, Frank pushed himself harder, knowing time was tightening. His hands cracked, despite the salve he rubbed into them each night, and his knees ached with a deep, familiar pain. Still, he worked, driven not by stubbornness, but by a quiet urgency rooted in memory. Shadow remained his constant companion, occasionally barking when loose snow shifted, or when a distant sound carried strangely through the cold air. Once, during a brief lull in snowfall, Frank paused to watch Shadow stand beneath the highest point of the frame, looking outward, tail low but steady. It struck Frank then that the dog trusted the structure, implicitly placing himself at its center, as if recognizing it as shelter even before it was complete. That trust mattered more than any neighbor's approval. By the end of the week, the skeletal form of the umbrella roof dominated the clearing, its wide reach casting long shadows across the snow even in weak winter sun. People slowed as they passed. Fewer laughed now. Some simply stared, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. Frank noticed, but remained inwardly focused, his thoughts circling the same truth that had guided him since Alaska winter was not an event, but a process, one that tested patience, foresight, and humility. As another storm gathered over Lake Superior, Frank secured his tools, checked the bracing one more time, and stood quietly beneath the rising roof with Shadow at his side. He did not know yet how many lives this structure would touch, how many assumptions it would dismantle. But he felt the old certainty settle in his chest. He was building something that understood winter, and that understanding would soon be tested. The storm arrived without ceremony, rolling in from Lake Superior, like a living wall swallowing the sky and flattening the horizon until Duluth seemed to exist inside a shaken globe of white. By the last week of November, winter abandoned any pretense of gradual arrival. Snow fell thick and fast, driven sideways by lake wind that screamed through streets and trees with surgical cruelty, and temperatures plunged past -30°C cold, sharp enough to make exposed skin ache within seconds. Frank Walker woke before dawn on the first morning of the storm, not because of noise, but because of silence, the kind that comes when snow absorbs sound and leaves the world unnervingly still. He sat up slowly, joints protesting, and listened to the wind batter the outer edges of the umbrella roof above him. The structure answered not with groans or creaks, but with a steady, diffused roar, as if the storm were being broken apart before it could strike home. Shadow rose immediately, his thick coat already dusted with snow from the open edges, and shook himself once before padding over, pressing his weight briefly against Frank's leg. The dog's amber eyes were calm. That calm mattered. Frank stepped outside into the covered space and felt the difference at once. Snow struck the outer ring of the roof and slid away in heavy sheets, thudding harmlessly to the ground beyond the posts. Beneath the shelter, the earth remained dark, and only lightly crusted boots sinking slightly, instead of crunching through ice. He exhaled slowly, breath fogging, and let himself take in what he was seeing, without satisfaction or surprise. This was what he had planned for. This was what the drawings had promised. He ran a gloved hand over stacked firewood, the pine dry and sharp-smelling, untouched by moisture. His tools lay where he had left them, visible, accessible. Shadow circled once and settled near the center post, tail wrapped around his legs, ears angled toward the storm, but body relaxed. Frank remembered another storm years earlier when he had stood exposed on a ridge in Alaska, wind clawing at his parka, while men scrambled to secure equipment that should never have been left vulnerable. He had learned then that shelter was not just protection, it was control. Across the neighborhood, control unraveled quickly. Tom Harris was awake before sunrise too, though for different reasons. His house groaned under uneven drifts, piling against one side of the roof, the snow heavier where wind had forced it into corners. Tom's thick beard, already crusted with ice, climbed onto the slick shingles with a shovel heart hammering as he tried to redistribute the weight before it became catastrophic. He had always trusted his craftsmanship, trusted the traditional pitched roof he'd built with his own hands, but now fear crept in through every groan of wood. Below, his wife shouted warnings through the door, her voice thin with panic. Tom worked fast, breath ragged, knowing one slip could send him sliding. From his precarious vantage point, he glimpsed Frank's place through the blowing snow and froze for a moment, not from cold, but from disbelief. Frank stood beneath that massive roof, upright and unhurried, while the storm tore uselessly at the structure's edges. Tom swallowed hard and went back to shoveling, pride cracking under the weight of evidence. Sarah Collins fared little better. Her small house was sound, but the shed where she kept winter supplies had not been built for this kind of assault. Snow drifted chest-high against the door, sealing it shut. She fought her way through knee-deep accumulation, to check on it, her tall, slender frame bending into the wind, pale face stinging as loose snow whipped against her skin. Her brown hair, pulled tight beneath her cap, escaped in damp strands that froze almost instantly. As she struggled with the buried door, she felt something close to despair tighten her chest. She had prepared as best she could, but preparation suddenly seemed fragile. That was when she noticed movement through the storm, shadow trotting along the inside edge of Frank's shelter, visible despite the swirling white. And then Frank himself, solid and deliberate, moving wood from one stack to another, unconcerned by the chaos beyond his roofline. Sarah stood there longer than she should have, watching the contrast imprinting itself on her mind. When she finally turned back, it was with a new, unsettled awareness that some people had prepared for a winter others were only now meeting. By midday, the storm worsened. Power flickered across the hillside, then failed entirely. Michael O'Rourke was called out despite the conditions, his city truck inching along roads already choked with snow. He was used to emergencies, used to working in weather that kept most people indoors. But this storm was testing even his hardened expectations. When his route took him near Frank's land, he pulled over briefly, hazard lights glowing dimly through the whiteout. He stepped out, boots sinking, and stared openly now. Snow slid cleanly off the roof's shallow slope, the wind deflected upward and outward by the overhang. Mike shook his head, snow collecting in his beard. Damn, he muttered, admiration cutting through his usual reserve. He made a mental note, the kind that sticks, the kind that changes how you think next time you're asked to assess risk. The storm lasted 3 days. By the second night, reports of collapsed sheds and damaged roofs filtered through battery-powered radios. One family down the slope lost their woodshed entirely, the structure crushed under weight. It was never designed to bear. Another neighbor was injured, slipping from his roof, his leg broken, his cries swallowed by wind, until help arrived too late to prevent serious damage. Frank heard these things secondhand, when Mike stopped by briefly on snowshoes, face-drawn eyes tired. Frank listened without comment, his jaw set, the old frustration stirring. Frustration not at the storm, but at the human tendency to underestimate what does not announce itself politely. That evening, as wind howled outside the umbrella roof, Frank split kindling calmly, Shadow watching each movement with quiet approval. He worked until his fingers stiffened, then stopped content with what had been done. On the third morning, the storm broke as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow lay in deep, uneven drifts, burying fences and cars, turning familiar paths into obstacles. Frank stepped out beneath his shelter and surveyed the damage with clear eyes. He did not feel vindicated. He felt sober. People began to emerge cautiously from their houses, faces drawn, movements tentative. Some looked toward Frank's place openly, now no laughter left in their expressions. Tom Harris trudged past later that day, shoulders slumped, avoiding Frank's gaze at first. When he finally looked up, there was no mockery left, only exhaustion and something like reluctant respect. He nodded once. Frank nodded back. No words were needed. That afternoon, Sarah made her way over, cheeks flushed from cold eyes, thoughtful. She stood just inside the shelter's edge, visibly registering the difference in temperature and wind. "It's different under here," she said quietly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Frank nodded. "That's the point." She looked around at the dry ground, the stacked wood, the calm dog at Frank's side. "You knew," she said, not accusingly, but with awe. Frank considered his answer. "I listened," he said finally. Sarah smiled faintly, the expression softening her sharp features, and for the first time since winter's arrival, she felt something close to hope. As the sun dipped low, casting pale light across the snowbound hillside, Frank stood beneath his roof and watched the neighborhood move differently, now slower, more cautious, more observant. Winter had broken its first rule and arrived early, violently, without warning. But the lesson it carried was already clear. Preparation was no longer theoretical. It was visible, tangible, and standing right there, casting a wide shadow across the snow. January arrived like a verdict. The lake froze in heavy plates, the wind sharpened, and the cold settled so deep into Duluth that even familiar streets felt foreign, stripped down to endurance alone. At 40 below, with wind chill, time itself seemed to slow each movement, measured against the cost of exposure. Frank Walker felt it in his knees when he stood in the morning, a deep ache that reminded him he was no longer a young soldier, moving on adrenaline alone. Still, he rose before light, layered his clothes carefully, and stepped beneath the umbrella roof, where the air, though brutally cold, was calm. The roof blocked the wind, and that difference, small on paper, was everything in reality. Shadow followed his thick coat, fluffed against the cold paws, silent on the packed ground. The dog was almost 10 now, his muzzle noticeably gray, but his posture remained strong, his eyes alert. He had learned Frank's rhythms so completely that he anticipated them moving aside when Frank lifted an axe, sitting when Frank paused, as if the two shared one steady pulse. The knock came mid-morning, dull and hesitant against the wooden post at the edge of the shelter. Frank looked up from splitting kindling axe paused mid-air, Shadow's ears snapped forward, body angling subtly between Frank and the sound. Frank set the axe down slowly and walked toward the edge of the roof. Standing there half buried in snow was Tom Harris. He looked smaller than Frank remembered, his stocky frame hunched inside a thick coat beard rimmed with frost cheeks, cracked and red from exposure. His eyes, usually sharp with skepticism, were dulled now by exhaustion. Tom had always been loud, confident, quick to laugh at what he didn't understand, but the storm-heavy weeks had stripped that away. He shifted his weight awkwardly, boots sinking. "Morning," he said, voice rough. Frank nodded once. Silence stretched, filled only by the distant groan of ice on the lake. Tom cleared his throat. "My woodshed collapsed 2 weeks ago," he said finally. "Snow load. I misjudged it." The admission seemed to cost him something. He swallowed. "We've been burning what we can salvage, but it's wet. Frozen solid half the time. Roads are blocked. I can't get to the forest. We're down to maybe 2 days' worth." He looked up, then meeting Frank's eyes. There was no pride left to protect, only fear. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't bad." Frank listened without interruption. He had imagined this moment not with satisfaction, but with inevitability. He turned and walked deeper under the shelter, Shadow padding alongside him. Tom followed, stepping into the calm air beneath the roof and stopping short. The difference hit him instantly. No wind. Ground mostly clear. Stacks of firewood rose in orderly rows, pine and fir split and seasoned their ends, pale and dry. Tom stared, jaw slack. Frank gestured once. 3 loads, he said. Tom blinked. That's too much." He started instinctively retreating from the scale of the offer. Frank shook his head. "It's enough," he replied. He did not explain further. Explanation wasn't needed. Tom's shoulders sagged, relief breaking through the exhaustion. His eyes shone, though, whether from cold or something else Frank couldn't tell. "I was wrong," Tom said quietly. Frank met his gaze. "You weren't prepared," he said. "That's not the same thing. Word travels quickly in winter." By the next day, others came. A young couple named Emily and Josh Miller arrived first, pulling a small sled behind them. Emily was in her late 20s, slight, with dark hair tucked into her hood, and a face pale from sleepless nights. Josh, broader and tense, had the rigid posture of someone trying to hold things together through force of will alone. They had moved to Duluth only months earlier, confident optimism still clinging to them like a thin coat. Their furnace had failed during the worst cold, and their backup wood supply was soaked through. Frank listened, nodded, and directed them under the shelter. He gave them what they could carry safely. Emily cried quietly as they loaded the sled, embarrassed and grateful all at once. Frank pretended not to notice. Later came Mrs. Eleanor Price, a widow in her early 70s, her hair white and neatly braided beneath her hat, her frame slight but upright. She walked with a cane, movements careful but proud. Eleanor had lived in Duluth all her life, outlasting 2 husbands and countless winters, but this one had caught her off balance. Her small woodshed leaned precariously after a partial collapse, and she could not repair it alone. She spoke calmly, her voice thin but steady, eyes sharp with intelligence that age had not dulled. Frank listened, then fetched wood himself, stacking it neatly on her sled, with practiced efficiency. Eleanor watched him for a long moment. "You built like my father used to," she said. "For weather, not for show." Frank paused, then nodded. He learned the hard way, he replied. "So did I." The last to arrive that week was a man Frank recognized immediately, though he had not expected to see him here. His name was Robert Bobby Lane, a fellow veteran a few years younger than Frank, with a thick gray beard and a pronounced limp from an old injury that had never healed correctly. Bobby's eyes were sharp but tired, his movements economical, shaped by pain and habit. He had served in a different unit, different wars, but Frank recognized the posture instantly, the way Bobby scanned his surroundings, even in exhaustion, the way he stood slightly angled, never fully relaxed. Bobby removed his gloves, slowly, fingers stiff. "Didn't think I'd be knocking on your door," he said, voice dry with humor that didn't quite land. "But here I am." Frank clasped his forearm briefly, a gesture older than words. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. Frank gave Bobby what he needed, no more, no less. Bobby accepted without false pride. Veterans understood logistics. As days passed, the umbrella roof became something else entirely. Not a curiosity, not a joke, a landmark. People no longer approached laughing or whispering. They came quietly, respectfully, eyes drawn to the wide shelter that had turned chaos into order. Shadow adapted to the steady flow of visitors with calm authority, positioning himself near Frank, but never aggressive, his presence reassuring rather than threatening. Children who accompanied their parents watched him with wide eyes, and Shadow, sensing their fear, lowered his head and wagged his tail, once slow and deliberate. Frank noticed and felt a tightness in his chest he did not name. At night, when the visitors were gone and the cold pressed in again, Frank sat under the shelter, listening to the quiet crackle of ice shifting in the distance. He counted his remaining firewood, automatically recalculating. He still had enough. More than enough. That knowledge brought neither pride nor anxiety, only confirmation. He had prepared not just for himself, but for the reality that winter always exposed the thinness of margins, the fragility of independence. He thought of the men he had lost years ago, of shelters that failed because someone had assumed conditions would be kinder than they were. He tightened his jacket and stared out into the dark. This roof, once mocked, now held the neighborhood together in ways walls never could. And winter was not done yet. Spring came late to Duluth, reluctant and uneven, as if winter were unwilling to loosen its grip on a place it had claimed so thoroughly. Snow lingered in the shadows long after the sun climbed higher, retreating inch by inch rather than all at once. The lake remained cold and dark, its surface cracking and groaning as ice broke apart under slow pressure. Frank Walker noticed these changes the way he noticed everything else, not with excitement, but with careful attention. Seasons, like people, revealed their intentions gradually. He continued his routines beneath the umbrella roof, even as temperatures rose, stacking tools, repairing what winter had worn down, moving through the space with the familiarity of someone who had lived many months inside its protection. Shadow followed more slowly now. The German Shepherd's once fluid gait had stiffened his joints, protesting after long nights on frozen ground. His muzzle had turned almost entirely gray, and his hearing was no longer sharp enough to catch every distant sound. Still, he returned to the same spot beneath the roof whenever snow fell, curling himself where the wind could not reach, trusting the shelter as completely as he trusted Frank. As the last of the heavy drifts melted away, the neighborhood changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The laughter that once followed Frank's project never returned. Instead, curiosity replaced it, cautious at first, then increasingly open. One morning, Frank found Tom Harris standing at the edge of his property again, but this time Tom did not look embarrassed or desperate. He looked thoughtful. His beard was trimmed shorter now, the lines in his face deeper from a winter that had humbled him. He walked slowly around the umbrella roof, studying the posts, the spacing, the angle of the beams. "I misjudged more than snow load," Tom admitted finally. "I misjudged what winter demands." Frank nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Most people do," he replied. Tom hesitated, then asked questions, practical ones this time. Measurements, timber selection, how deep the posts had to go to resist frost heave. Frank answered simply, without embellishment, his words precise, stripped of ego. Soon Tom was not alone. Another family joined him a few days later, the Petersons from up the hill, their expressions cautious but sincere. They had lost part of their roof in February and spent the rest of winter repairing damage instead of living. Frank walked them through the shelter, pointing out details they would have overlooked: how the wide overhang redirected drifting snow, how the open sides prevented moisture buildup, how the roof's shallow pitch encouraged snow to shed before weight accumulated. The Petersons listened closely, nodding occasionally, exchanging glances that spoke of lessons learned the hard way. Sarah Collins came as well, standing quietly near the central post while others spoke. Her tall, slender figure was less bundled now, her pale skin no longer raw from constant cold, though winter had left faint shadows beneath her green eyes. She had cut her hair slightly shorter, a practical change, and she moved with a new confidence born of survival. When Frank paused, she asked softly, "Why make it bigger than the house?" Frank looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because life doesn't stop at the walls," he said. Sarah smiled faintly, understanding settling in her expression, like something fitting into place. By early summer, the sound of saws returned to the hillside. 2 families began building shelters of their own. The first was Tom Harris, who chose to start small, constructing a roof about 30 feet across behind his house. He worked carefully, slower than he used to, measuring twice where once he might have rushed. The second was a man named Daniel Ruiz, new to the area, but observant, his dark hair streaked with gray, his frame lean from years of physical labor. Daniel had grown up in northern New Mexico, where winters were harsh in different ways, and he approached the project with humility rather than pride. Frank visited both sites occasionally, offering advice when asked, never insisting. Both men made mistakes. Posts set too shallow, joints cut too short, but they corrected them, learning through effort rather than argument. Neither structure matched the quiet elegance of Frank's original, but both worked. That was enough. Life moved forward beneath the umbrella roof. Frank replaced worn boards, tightened straps, adjusted drainage where meltwater pooled. The structure aged gracefully, requiring attention, but never failing. The cabin beneath it was rebuilt once then again, logs settling and shifting with time, but the roof remained constant. Shadow grew older still. His hearing faded further, his vision clouded at the edges, but he never lost his sense of place. On snowy days, even years later, Frank would find him in the same spot, facing outward body, relaxed beneath the wide shelter. Frank adjusted his routines to match the dog's slowing pace, taking shorter walks, resting more often. He spoke to Shadow sometimes not because he expected answers, but because the silence felt less heavy when filled with familiar words. Frank lived another decade under that roof. The years softened him in ways winter never could. Children grew up, some of them remembering the strange roof from their earliest memories, not as an oddity, but as a landmark. Storms came and went, some brutal, some merciful, but none caught Frank unprepared. When he finally passed one quiet spring morning, the umbrella roof stood unchanged, weathered but sound. Shadow did not live much longer after that, his body giving out as gently as it could, laid to rest beneath a stand of pines, not far from where he had kept watch for so many winters. The roof remained. Frank's property passed to relatives who understood its value and added to it rather than replacing it, enclosing parts of the space for workshops, leaving others open as Frank had. And in Duluth, the lesson endured. People spoke of preparation differently now, not as paranoia or excess, but as respect for forces larger than oneself. They remembered the old veteran who built a roof too big for his house and taught a neighborhood how to survive winter without fear. True wisdom, they learned, often looks strange at first. It is mistaken for stubbornness, eccentricity, or waste until the season that matters arrives and proves otherwise. At the end of this story, there is a quiet truth that reaches beyond wood, snow, or even survival. Some call it preparation, some call it wisdom, but others recognize it as grace. Because there are moments in life when God does not arrive as thunder or fire, but as foresight placed gently in a human heart. Frank did not hear a voice from heaven telling him to build that roof. He was simply given the understanding to prepare before the storm came. And that understanding arriving at the right time, guiding the right hands, can itself be a kind of miracle. In our daily lives, we often mistake God's protection for coincidence. We pray for rescue, yet overlook the quiet guidance that teaches us to be ready. The roof did not stop the winter. It did not remove suffering. But it created space to work, to endure, to help others. And sometimes that is exactly how God works, not by removing the storm, but by giving us shelter within it and the strength to become shelter for someone else. May this story remind us to listen when wisdom whispers, even if others laugh. May it encourage us to prepare our hearts, our homes, and our lives, not out of fear, but out of love. And may God bless every person watching today, protect your families, guide your decisions, and give you shelter in the seasons that feel overwhelming. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you find comfort and meaning in stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing them with you. May God watch over you, walk beside you, and grant you peace today and always.